The shovel struck the earth with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the stillness of the night. I froze behind my kitchen window, coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, as I watched my neighbor, Frank Whitaker, digging frantically in his backyard. The beam of his flashlight carved erratic patterns through the darkness as he worked, his movements urgent and furtive. Something about the scene felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Frank had always been the model neighbor since I moved to Oak Ridge Lane 3 years ago. Friendly waves across our adjoining fences, offers to collect my mail when I traveled, even surprise deliveries of his famous homemade sourdough on Sunday mornings. The kind of neighbor people in suburbs dream of having. But at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, that wholesome image was unraveling before my eyes. There was no mistaking what I was seeing. Frank was burying something. Something wrapped in what looked like a dark garbage bag, roughly the size of a small suitcase. My hand trembled slightly, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of my mug. I set it down on the counter, never taking my eyes off the scene unfolding through my window. Frank kept looking over his shoulder, scanning his surroundings with nervous energy. He hadn't noticed me watching from my darkened kitchen. The rational part of my brain offered innocent explanations. Perhaps he was burying a beloved pet? But the hour, his furtive movements, and something in his body language suggested otherwise. When he finally patted down the last of the dirt and hurriedly gathered his tools, I ducked away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The man who had brought me chicken soup when I had the flu last winter might have just buried evidence of God knows what 20 yards from where I lay. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overreacting. Frank was a retired high school teacher, for heaven's sake. A widower who volunteered at the local animal shelter and played chess in the park with other retirees. There had to be a logical explanation. But when I went to put out my garbage bins before work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh dirt under Frank's fingernails as he waved good morning to me, and a small smear of what looked disturbingly like dried blood on the cuff of his shirt. "Sleep well, Margaret?" he called out cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. I forced a smile. "Like a baby," I lied. That was the moment I knew I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. Something dark was happening right next door, and I was the only one who knew. Before all this, my life had been refreshingly ordinary. After 30 years of teaching elementary school in Chicago, I'd retired early at 58 when my mother passed and left me her modest inheritance. The city had become too loud, too fast, too everything, so I'd sought out the quiet charm of Millfield, a town small enough to know your neighbors, but large enough that you weren't expected to know everyone. My little Cape Cod on Oak Ridge Lane had been perfect. A garden for my newfound interest in heirloom tomatoes, a sunroom for reading, and enough distance from neighbors to feel private but not isolated. Then Frank Whitaker had shown up with a welcome basket the day after I moved in. "New beginnings deserve celebration," he'd said with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Frank was tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair and the kind of tan that comes from genuine outdoor work rather than tanning beds. He had to be in his mid-60s, but he moved with the energy of someone much younger. He told me he'd been in the house next door for almost 40 years. "Raised my daughter here with my late wife Elaine," he'd explained. "Couldn't bear to leave after she passed. Too many memories in these walls." I'd found his sentimentality touching. As a widow myself, though I'd lost Robert so many years ago to a sudden heart attack that the sharp edges of grief had long since worn smooth, I understood the comfort of familiar surroundings. Over the 3 years since I'd moved in, Frank had become something of a fixture in my life. Not in an intrusive way, but in the background, dependable, kind, occasionally bringing over extra tomato seedlings or offering to help when a particularly violent storm had taken down part of my fence. "Margaret," he'd say, "neighbors are the family we choose by choosing where to live." It was the kind of folksy wisdom that made me smile. I'd never had reason to question anything about Frank Whitaker, until that night with the shovel and the mysterious package. The day after I witnessed the midnight burial, I found myself sitting in my car outside the local library, using their Wi-Fi to search Frank's name. I felt ridiculous, like a character in one of those mystery novels I devoured, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a shroud. The search results were disappointingly benign. A mention in the local paper about his retirement from Millfield High after 32 years of teaching biology. His name on the animal shelter's donor appreciation page. A few photos from community events. Nothing sinister, nothing that suggested a man with dark secrets. I was about to close my laptop when I noticed an article from nearly 4 decades ago. Local teacher questioned in disappearance of former student. My finger hovered over the link, a chill running through me despite the warm spring day. The article was brief and ultimately inconclusive. 19-year-old Amelia Carson had gone missing after reportedly having an argument with an unnamed teacher. Frank had been questioned but never charged, and the case had apparently gone cold. The girl had never been found. I closed my laptop with trembling hands. It could be nothing, a coincidence, a routine questioning that led nowhere. But combined with what I'd witnessed in the dark hours of the previous night, it planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't ignore. That evening, as I watered my garden, I found myself studying Frank's backyard, trying to identify exactly where he had been digging. The soil looked undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. He'd been thorough. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Frank's voice startled me so badly I nearly dropped my watering can. He was standing at our shared fence, gardening gloves on, pruning shears in hand. "Oh, yes, perfect for the garden," I managed, hoping my voice sounded normal. "Those tomatoes are coming along nicely," he nodded toward my plants. "Say, I'm making a big pot of beef stew tomorrow. Too much for just me. Would you like to come over for dinner? Around 6? Every instinct screamed at me to decline, to distance myself from this man who might not be who he seemed. But another part of me, the part that wanted answers, saw an opportunity. "That sounds lovely," I heard myself say. "Can I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Frank smiled, and I noticed how his eyes didn't quite match the warmth of his expression. "And maybe your appetite for good food and better conversation." As I watched him return to his gardening, I wondered if I had just made a terrible mistake. But I also knew that if I wanted to uncover the truth about what Frank Whitaker had buried that night, I needed to get closer, not further away. I just hoped I wouldn't regret it. The next day dragged interminably. I tried to occupy myself with normal activities, reading, tending to my garden, calling my daughter in Seattle, but my mind kept returning to the impending dinner at Frank's house. By 5:30, I had changed outfits 3 times, finally settling on a casual blue dress that wouldn't suggest I had made any special effort. I debated whether to tell someone where I was going, just in case. In the end, I sent a text to my daughter. "Having dinner with my neighbor Frank tonight, his famous beef stew." It was casual enough not to worry her, but would leave a digital breadcrumb if anything happened. At precisely 6 o'clock, I stood on Frank's porch, a bottle of Cabernet in hand despite his insistence I needn't bring anything. The door swung open before I could knock. "Margaret, right on time." Frank's smile was broad, welcoming. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, his silver hair neatly combed. Nothing about him suggested a man harboring dark secrets, and yet my heart raced as I stepped over the threshold. His house was a mirror image of mine in layout, but where my decor leaned toward cozy minimalism, Frank's home was a testament to a life fully lived. Bookshelves overflowed with well-worn volumes. Photographs crowded every surface, most featuring a young woman I assumed was his daughter, and a petite woman with kind eyes who must have been Elaine. "Your home is lovely," I said, meaning it despite my apprehension. "Thank you. It's been a bit too quiet since Sarah moved to California, but we talk every Sunday." He led me through to the kitchen, where the rich aroma of beef stew filled the air. "She's a marine biologist, following in the old man's scientific footsteps, though she went a different direction than my biology." The kitchen was immaculate and surprisingly modern. New appliances, granite countertops, a large island where 2 places had been set. "Wine?" Frank held up a corkscrew. "Please." I needed something to steady my nerves. As he poured, I noticed a door off the kitchen, slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see stairs leading down to what must be the basement. Something about that partially open door made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "So," Frank said, handing me a glass, "tell me more about that daughter of yours. Jenny, right? In Seattle?" I took a sip of wine, startled. "Yes, Jennifer. Did I mention she lives in Seattle?" Frank's expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into an easy smile. I'm sure you must have at some point. You know how it is. Neighbors chat, details stick. But I couldn't recall ever telling Frank where Jenny lived. We weren't that kind of close. Dinner itself was delicious, the stew rich and flavorful, the sourdough bread he served alongside it warm and crusty. We talked about inconsequential things: the unusually warm spring, the new coffee shop in town, my struggles with growing cucumbers. Normal, neighborly conversation. Yet underneath it all was a current of tension I couldn't shake. Several times I caught Frank watching me with an intensity that seemed at odds with our casual conversation, and twice more during the evening, my eyes were drawn to that basement door. More wine? Frank offered, already reaching for the bottle. I probably shouldn't. I'm driving after all, I laughed, though the distance between our houses made the excuse absurd. Driving? It's 50 feet across our yards, Margaret. His tone was teasing, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. Well, when you put it that way. I held out my glass, deciding it was better to appear at ease. But just a little. As he poured, I gathered my courage. You know, Frank, I was up late the other night, insomnia, you know how it is, and I thought I saw you in your backyard. It must have been around 2 in the morning? His hand stilled momentarily, wine bottle suspended over my glass. Then he continued pouring, his expression giving nothing away. Must have been someone else, he said lightly. I'm an early to bed, early to rise type. Haven't seen 2 a.m. in years unless it's a bathroom trip. He chuckled, setting the bottle down. Though I did have to bury one of the shelter cats recently. Poor thing had kidney failure. But that was mid-afternoon, not the middle of the night. It was a plausible explanation, one that aligned with his known volunteer work. Yet I was certain of what I had seen, and it hadn't been the middle of the afternoon. My mistake, I murmured, taking another sip of wine. Must have been a trick of the light. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced pleasantries. When I finally made my excuses to leave, Frank insisted on walking me home, despite my protests. What kind of gentleman would I be if I didn't see you safely to your door? He said, his tone light, but brooking no argument. As we walked the short distance between our houses, the night air cool against my flushed cheeks, I couldn't help but feel I was being escorted by a predator rather than a protector. At my door, Frank took my hand in his. His palm was warm, his grip just slightly too firm to be comfortable. I've enjoyed this evening, Margaret. We should do it again soon. His eyes held mine, searching for something. And please, if you're ever up in the middle of the night again and see something concerning, come knock on my door. No need to wonder or worry alone. The message was clear. He knew I had seen him, and he was watching me too. Of course, I said, extracting my hand from his. Good night, Frank. Inside, with the door locked behind me, I leaned against the wall and tried to steady my breathing. Whatever Frank Whitaker had buried that night, I was now certain it wasn't a shelter cat, and whatever it was, he was willing to lie to cover it up. I needed to find out what was in that hole, but I also needed to be careful, very careful, because tonight had made one thing crystal clear. Frank Whitaker was not the harmless, kindly neighbor I had believed him to be, and I had just let him know I was watching. The next few days passed in a strange dance of normalcy and dread. Frank and I exchanged our usual waves and pleasantries when we saw each other, as if our dinner conversation had never happened. But there was a new undercurrent to our interactions, a watchfulness, an awareness that we were both playing roles. I found myself jumping at small sounds in the night, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. I installed a security camera at my back door, angled partially toward Frank's yard, telling myself it was just a precaution any woman living alone might take. 4 nights after our dinner, my vigilance was rewarded, or perhaps punished. At 1:43 a.m., my phone alerted me to movement detected by the security camera. Heart pounding, I checked the footage to see Frank once again in his backyard, this time carrying what looked like a heavy duffel bag toward the same area he had dug before. I crept to my kitchen window, staying well back in the shadows. Through the darkness, I could make out Frank's silhouette as he removed something from the ground, presumably what he had buried before, and replaced it with the contents of the duffel bag. Then he carefully restored the earth, spreading leaves and twigs over the disturbed soil. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Was he moving evidence? Rotating bodies? The thought made me physically ill, but I couldn't look away. When he finished and went back inside his house, I remained frozen by my window, unsure what to do. Call the police? And tell them what? That my elderly neighbor was doing suspicious gardening in the middle of the night? I had no proof of anything criminal, just a pattern of bizarre behavior. I needed more information before I could act. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that the answers lay in Frank's basement, behind that door that had drawn my attention during dinner. The next morning, I called in a favor from an old friend who had moved to Millfield a year after I did. Diane had been my teaching colleague back in Chicago, and now lived across town with her husband. I need a huge favor, I told her over coffee at her kitchen table. I need you to call my neighbor Frank around 11 and keep him on the phone for at least 15 minutes. Diane's eyebrows shot up. Margaret, what on earth are you up to? I hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. I think Frank might have taken something of mine, a family heirloom. I saw him carrying something that looked like it from his car to his house last week. I just want to peek through his windows while he's distracted, see if I can spot it. That doesn't sound like you, Diane said skeptically. Why not just ask him? Because if I'm wrong, it would be incredibly awkward. We're neighbors, Diane. I have to live next to this man. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. But if you get arrested for breaking and entering, I'm not bailing you out. I'm not breaking in, I assured her. Just looking through windows. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had no intention of breaking in. But I also knew that Frank, like many people in our safe little town, often left his back door unlocked during the day. At precisely 11 o'clock, I watched from my window as Frank answered his landline phone. I gave it 2 minutes, then slipped out my back door and across our adjoining yards, heart hammering so loudly I was sure it could be heard across the neighborhood. Frank's back door was indeed unlocked. I hesitated only briefly before stepping inside, justifying my trespass with the conviction that I might be preventing something far worse. I could hear Frank's voice from the front of the house, engaged in conversation with Diane. No, I understand completely, he was saying. Technology can be so confusing. Now you said the screen is completely blue? Bless Diane for the fake computer problem. It would keep him occupied. I moved silently through the kitchen toward that basement door, which stood closed today. The handle turned easily under my trembling fingers, revealing the same stairs I had glimpsed during dinner. Taking a deep breath, I descended into the unknown. The basement was surprisingly well lit and finished, not the dank cobwebbed space I had imagined. One half served as a workshop, with a large table, covered in woodworking tools and projects in various stages of completion. The other half. My blood ran cold. The other half of the basement had been converted into what could only be described as a shrine. Photos covered one entire wall, dozens of them, all of young women. Some appeared to be newspaper clippings or school photos, others looked like they had been taken surreptitiously, from a distance. And in the center of it all was a larger portrait of a pretty young woman with auburn hair and a confident smile. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, Amelia Carson, 1965 to 1984. The missing student from the article I had found. But it was what stood beneath the photos that truly horrified me. A long table held items that could only be described as trophies. Jewelry, hair clips, a collection of driver's licenses, even what appeared to be locks of hair carefully labeled with names and dates. And at the far end of the table, partially covered by a cloth, was something that made my gorge rise. What looked disturbingly like human bones. I backed away, a scream building in my throat that I desperately fought to contain. As I turned to flee, my elbow caught a small box on a shelf, sending it crashing to the floor. The contents spilled out. More photos, these more recent, and with a shock of recognition, I realized they were photos of me. Me gardening. Me collecting my mail. Me through my kitchen window, reading a book. Frank had been watching me all along. From upstairs, I heard his voice change tone. Well, thank you for calling, but I really must go now. I think I heard something in my basement. Panic surged through me. I scrambled up the stairs as quietly as I could, praying I could make it out before Frank caught me. I had just reached the top when the door swung open, revealing Frank standing there, phone still in hand, his expression shifting from surprise to something far more dangerous. "Margaret," he said, his voice eerily calm. "What an unexpected visit." "Frank," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I dropped off that book you mentioned wanting to borrow, and I heard a noise." The lie was pathetic, transparent. His eyes, normally warm and crinkled at the corners, had gone flat and cold. "Did you now? And where is this book?" I glanced down at my empty hands, then back at him. "I must have left it downstairs." "I see." Frank's posture shifted subtly, blocking my exit more effectively. "And did you find what you were looking for down there, Margaret?" There was no point in continuing the charade. He knew what I had seen. "Who was she, Frank? Amelia Carson?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "A student. Bright girl. Had her whole life ahead of her." "Until you took it from her?" The words came out before I could stop them. Frank's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Is that what you think? That I killed her?" He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand anything, Margaret. But then, how could you? You've only seen a fraction of the picture." "I saw enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "The shrine, the trophies, the bones, Frank, and the other women, how many were there?" "None." His answer was sharp, definitive. "There was only Amelia. The others, the others I saved." "Saved?" I repeated incredulously. "From men like the one who took Amelia." Frank's eyes had taken on a faraway look. "I was her teacher, yes. And I loved her. Not the way they implied during the investigation, not inappropriately. She was like a daughter to me, came to me for advice, for guidance. She told me she was afraid of someone, but wouldn't say who. Then she disappeared." He stepped closer, and it took everything in me not to back away. "Do you know what that does to a person, Margaret? To know someone you cared about was afraid, came to you for help, and you failed them? They never found her body, never arrested anyone. The case went cold. So you, what, became some kind of vigilante?" I was struggling to reconcile this story with the evidence I had seen downstairs. I started paying attention to the girls who seemed afraid, who changed their behavior suddenly, who showed signs. I watched, and I listened, and when I was certain, absolutely certain, I acted. A chill ran through me as the implications of his words sank in. "The things you bury in your yard at night." Frank's expression hardened. "Not what you're thinking. Evidence. Things that would connect these men to their crimes. Things I've collected over decades. I move them occasionally, rotate the hiding spots. Can't risk keeping it all in one place, or in the house where a search warrant would find it." "But the bones," I whispered. "Animal bones. I taught biology, Margaret. But they look human enough to frighten a confession out of someone who believes I might have already killed their victim." My head was spinning, trying to process this new narrative. Could it be true? Was Frank not a killer but some twisted kind of protector? The photos of me flashed in my mind. And the pictures of me? How do you explain those? For the first time, Frank looked genuinely uncomfortable. "That's different. When you moved in, something about you reminded me of Elaine. The way you garden, your laugh. I know it's not right, but I couldn't help myself. It wasn't meant to be threatening." The explanation made my skin crawl despite its pathetic sincerity. This man had been obsessing over me, photographing me without my knowledge, all while I thought we were just friendly neighbors. "I need to leave, Frank." I took a step to the side, trying to edge around him toward the door. His arm shot out, blocking my path. "I can't let you do that, Margaret. Not until you understand. Not until you promise you won't go to the police." "The police should know about this, Frank. If what you're saying is true, if you have evidence of crimes." "Evidence obtained illegally is worthless in court," he cut me off. "And some of these men are powerful, connected. The system protects them. I've seen it happen." "So what then?" My voice had taken on a hysterical edge. "You keep me here until I agree with your vigilante justice?" Frank's expression softened slightly. "No, Margaret. I just want you to listen, to understand. Then you can make your choice." He gestured toward the living room, maintaining his position between me and the exit. I weighed my options and decided that appearing to cooperate was my best chance of getting out of this situation safely. I moved toward the couch, sitting on the very edge, poised for flight. Frank remained standing, his tall frame now somehow more menacing than it had ever appeared before. "It started 3 years after Amelia disappeared," he began. "A girl in my sophomore biology class began showing up with bruises. When I asked, she gave the usual excuses: clumsy, fell down, walked into a door. But I recognized the fear in her eyes. It was the same look Amelia had had in the weeks before she vanished." He paced as he spoke, his movements agitated but his voice controlled. "I started watching her house. Saw her stepfather drag her into a car one night, followed them to an abandoned property outside town. What he was planning to do..." Frank's voice broke. "I couldn't let it happen again. I confronted him. Things got physical. I didn't mean to push him so hard, but when he fell, he hit his head on a concrete block." My breath caught. "You killed him." Frank's eyes met mine, unflinching. "I protected that girl. And when I realized no one would believe it was an accident, not with my history of being questioned about Amelia, I made a choice. I buried his wallet, his watch, the belt he'd taken off. Anything that might connect him to what he'd planned to do. I left his body where it was, but removed anything that might identify him." "And the girl?" "Told her to go home, to tell everyone he'd left town, abandoned them. Which is exactly what people believed when he never came back. Wife even filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment a year later." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't just one incident. Frank's basement suggested decades of similar interventions. "How many, Frank? How many men have you..." "Killed?" He shook his head. "Only 3 in 40 years. And each one was about to do something unforgivable. The others, the ones represented by those items downstairs, those were different. Evidence I collected and used to make them leave town, to threaten them with exposure if they didn't disappear from their victims' lives." "You can't take the law into your own hands," I said, though my conviction was wavering in the face of his absolute certainty. "Someone has to, when the law fails." Frank finally sat down, not beside me, but in an armchair across the coffee table. "The things I've seen, Margaret, the things people do to those weaker than themselves, to those who trust them, someone has to stand in the gap." "And the thing you buried the other night? What was that?" Frank's expression darkened. "The new vice principal at Millfield High. I may be retired, but I still have friends there. Teachers talk. 3 female students have complained about him making them uncomfortable, making suggestive comments. Nothing actionable yet, at least not in the administration's eyes. But I've seen this pattern before." "So you're what? Planting evidence? Setting him up?" "Insurance," Frank corrected. "Something I can use if needed. Something that connects to a cold case in his previous school district." The moral complexity of this situation was overwhelming. If Frank was telling the truth, if he had spent decades protecting vulnerable girls from predators, could I really condemn him? But the methods, the obsession, the shrine-like quality of his basement collection, it wasn't the work of a healthy mind, regardless of the intention. "Frank, you need help," I said gently. "Professional help. This isn't normal what you're doing, even if your intentions are good." His face hardened. "Don't patronize me, Margaret. I'm not crazy. I'm necessary." "Then why the pictures of me? What was necessary about that?" The question seemed to deflate him somewhat. "That was personal. A weakness. Loneliness, perhaps. As I said, you remind me of Elaine." "I'm not Elaine," I said firmly, "and I can't pretend I never saw what's in your basement. I can't unsee it." "So what will you do?" Frank leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Go to the police? Tell them your neighbor has a collection of trinkets and bones? They'll think you're the crazy one, and if they do take you seriously enough to get a warrant, if they find what you saw, do you know what happens then?" I remained silent, waiting. Every case I've ever influenced gets reopened. Every predator I've driven away might come back. Every victim who's managed to rebuild their life gets dragged back into their nightmare. His voice had taken on a pleading quality. "Is that justice, Margaret? Is that what you want?" It was the impossible choice. report what I knew and potentially cause more harm than good, or keep silent and be complicit in Frank's disturbed version of justice. And underneath it all was the fear that perhaps Frank wasn't being entirely truthful, that his story was a manipulation designed to keep me quiet about something far more sinister. I need time, I said finally. Time to think. Frank nodded slowly. I understand. But understand this, Margaret. I've dedicated my life to protecting the vulnerable. I won't let anyone compromise that mission. Not even you. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I stood up, relieved when Frank made no move to stop me. I'll see myself out, I said, moving toward the front door, rather than retracing my steps through the kitchen. Frank followed at a distance. We'll talk again soon, he said as I stepped onto his porch. It wasn't a question. I didn't look back as I walked across our adjoining yards to my own house. Only when I was safely inside, doors locked, did I allow myself to break down, tears streaming down my face, as I tried to reconcile the kind neighbor I thought I knew with the complicated, dangerous man I had discovered. Whatever I decided to do next would change everything, not just for Frank and me, but potentially for dozens of others whose lives had been touched by his twisted form of justice. And I had no idea what the right choice was. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. I sat in my darkened living room, watching Frank's house, wondering if he was doing the same, watching me, waiting for my decision. The weight of knowledge pressed down on me like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe, to think clearly. By dawn, I had made no progress toward a decision. I went through the motions of my morning routine: coffee, toast, watering the plants, all while feeling as though I was moving through a thick fog. The world had taken on a surreal quality, everyday actions rendered strange by the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of normal life. Around 10, my phone rang. It was Diane. Margaret, are you okay? You never called me back yesterday to let me know how your little reconnaissance mission went. I had completely forgotten about our arrangement, about my promise to update her. I'm fine, I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. False alarm. It wasn't my heirloom after all. You sound strange, Diane said, concern evident in her voice. Did something happen? No, just didn't sleep well. Listen, can I call you back later? I'm in the middle of something. After reassuring Diane and ending the call, I found myself drawn to my computer. I spent hours researching Frank's claims, looking for news reports about missing persons in our area over the decades, cross-referencing with what little I knew about the trophies I had seen in his basement. To my surprise, and growing unease, I found corroborating evidence for some of his story. There had indeed been a case involving a high school sophomore whose stepfather had abandoned the family around the time Frank had mentioned. The man had never been found, and the case had eventually been closed. The girl had gone on to college, become a doctor, and now practiced medicine in a city about 50 miles away. I found similar patterns with other names I remembered from the labels in Frank's collection: young women who had overcome difficult circumstances, whose apparent abusers had vanished or suddenly moved away. It lent credence to Frank's narrative, but did nothing to resolve my moral dilemma. As evening approached, I knew I couldn't put off a decision any longer. Frank would be expecting an answer. The question was, what would that answer be? I was still deliberating when a knock at my door startled me from my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw not Frank, but a younger man in casual business attire, holding what appeared to be a briefcase. Cautiously, I opened the door. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Margaret Holloway? I'm Michael Whitaker, Frank's son-in-law. May I come in? There's something important we need to discuss." Son-in-law? Frank had only ever mentioned his daughter Sarah, never a son-in-law. But the man's surname matched, and there was something in his bearing that suggested authority, confidence. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let him in. "Frank isn't home," Michael said, moving into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "He asked me to come speak with you while he's at his doctor's appointment." "I wasn't aware Frank had a son-in-law," I said carefully, remaining near the door. Michael's smile tightened. 10 years now. Sarah and I live in California, as I'm sure he's mentioned. I'm in town for a conference and thought I'd surprise him, but it seems he had other concerns more pressing than a family visit. There was an edge to his voice that set off warning bells in my mind. Something wasn't right here. What exactly did Frank ask you to discuss with me? I kept my tone neutral, non-confrontational. Michael set his briefcase on my coffee table and clicked it open. Frank is concerned about your discovery yesterday. He thought perhaps I could help explain the situation more clearly, given my background in law enforcement. My blood ran cold. You're a police officer? Detective, actually. Though not here, I work in Sacramento. He removed a folder from his briefcase. Frank has kept meticulous records over the years. He thought you might need more convincing evidence of the good he's done. He held out the folder to me, but I made no move to take it. This entire situation felt wrong, orchestrated. If Frank really wanted to provide me with more evidence, why not do it himself? And why would he tell this man, son-in-law or not, about what had happened? I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, moving toward my front door. I haven't discovered anything about Frank, and we have no issues to discuss. Michael's expression hardened. Ms. Holloway, let's not play games. Frank told me everything, about your trespassing, about what you saw in his basement. He's worried, and rightfully so. A man in his position can't afford misunderstandings. I'd like you to leave now, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Whatever Frank may have told you, I have nothing to discuss with you. Michael closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. That's disappointing. I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. He reached into his jacket, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he might be drawing a weapon. Instead, he produced a business card, which he placed on my coffee table. When you're ready to be reasonable, call me, for Frank's sake, and your own. I hope that's soon. He brushed past me and out the door, which I quickly locked behind him. Through my window, I watched him walk not toward Frank's house, but to a dark sedan parked on the street. As he drove away, I grabbed my phone and with shaking fingers searched for Michael Whitaker, Sacramento Police. No results matched that description. A wave of nausea washed over me as the implications became clear. Either Michael had lied about his identity and profession, or Frank had lied about having a son-in-law named Michael at all. Either way, the man who had just been in my home was not who he claimed to be. And now he knew that I knew something about Frank's secret basement. I was fumbling with my phone, trying to decide whether to call the actual police, when a text message arrived from an unknown number. That wasn't wise, Margaret. We need to talk. Come to my house. Now. Frank. I stared at the message, fear and anger warring within me. Who was Michael really? One of Frank's vigilante associates? Or something worse? And how had Frank gotten my cell number? I had never given it to him. Before I could decide how to respond, another text arrived. Don't make me come get you. The threat was unmistakable. Whatever twisted justice Frank believed he was serving, he now saw me as a threat to his mission. And threats, in Frank's world, needed to be neutralized. I had run out of time to deliberate. I needed to act. With trembling hands, I texted Diane. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, call police. Send them to Frank Whitaker's house on Oak Ridge Lane. This is not a joke. Then, taking a deep breath, I walked out my front door and across the yard toward Frank's house, where I knew he was waiting. This time, I wasn't going as a neighbor or a friend. I was going as someone who had seen behind the mask, who knew the darkness that lived next door. And I had no idea if I would be coming back. Frank opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been watching for me. His expression was a mixture of regret and determination. Margaret, he said, stepping aside to let me enter. Thank you for coming. The house felt different now, oppressive, threatening. I remained standing just inside the entryway, unwilling to move further into Frank's domain. Who was that man, Frank? He wasn't your son-in-law. Frank sighed heavily. No, he wasn't. Michael is an associate, someone who helps me occasionally. I thought he might be able to convince you where I had failed. Convince me of what? To keep quiet about your vigilante justice? Your basement shrine? The fact that by your own admission, you've killed 3 people? To understand the necessity of what I do, Frank said, his voice taking on that same fervent quality I had heard the day before. To see that sometimes the official channels of justice aren't enough. Sometimes someone needs to step in. And you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. I couldn't keep the disgust from my voice. That's not justice, Frank. That's playing God. His expression hardened. You've never seen what I've seen, Margaret. Never had to watch as a system designed to protect the innocent fails them time and again. Never had to comfort a child whose abuser walks free because there wasn't enough evidence or because the right palms were greased. So that justifies murder? Stalking? Creating a shrine of trophies like some kind of serial killer? Frank flinched at the comparison. It's not a shrine. It's a reminder. Every item represents someone I helped, someone I saved. And the photos of me? Who were you saving when you took those? He had the grace to look ashamed. That was different. A personal weakness, as I said before. It was a violation, I countered. Just like everything else you've done. You violated the trust of this community, the laws we all agree to live by. Laws that protect the powerful and fail the vulnerable, Frank shot back. I don't expect you to understand, Margaret. I had hoped you might, but I see now that was naive of me. He moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for me to follow. Reluctantly, I did, hyper-aware of the basement door that stood between us and Frank's collection of horrors. So what happens now? I asked, stopping at the threshold of the kitchen. Your friend Michael implied there would be consequences if I didn't cooperate. Frank turned to face me, his expression unreadable. That depends entirely on you, Margaret, on what you decide to do with what you know. Are you threatening me, Frank? He shook his head slowly. No, I don't want to hurt you. I've never wanted to hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. He paused, his eyes searching mine. But I can't let you destroy everything I've built, everything I've done to protect those who can't protect themselves. The implication hung in the air between us. Frank would stop me, one way or another, if I tried to expose him. So those are my choices? Keep your secrets, or become another one of them? I gestured toward the basement door. It doesn't have to be that way, Frank said, his tone softening. You could understand. You could help. The suggestion shocked me. Help? You want me to join your vigilante crusade? You were a teacher too, Margaret. You must have seen the signs, must have had students you worried about, ones the system failed. Didn't you ever wish you could do more? The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. There had been children over my years of teaching whose situations had kept me up at night, whose bruises or withdrawal or fear had raised red flags that somehow got lost in bureaucratic paperwork and overworked social services. That doesn't make what you're doing right, I said, but my voice had lost some of its conviction. Frank sensed the weakness. No, perhaps not right in the conventional sense, but necessary, effective. He took a step toward me. I've saved lives, Margaret. Real, innocent lives that would have been destroyed without my intervention. At what cost? Your soul? Your humanity? A price I've been willing to pay. His gaze was unwavering. The question is, what price are you willing to pay? To turn me in means to potentially send those I've protected back into danger. To stay silent means carrying the burden of knowledge. Neither choice is without consequence. It was the same impossible choice I had been grappling with since discovering Frank's secret, but now the stakes felt even higher. This wasn't just about moral abstractions anymore. This was about my safety, and the safety of others. I need proof, I said suddenly. Proof that what you're saying is true, that the people you claim to have helped are really better off because of your actions. Frank considered this for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, come with me. He led me not to the basement as I had feared, but to his study, a small room off the living room that I hadn't noticed during my previous visits. Inside, filing cabinets lined one wall, and a desktop computer hummed quietly on a simple wooden desk. Frank unlocked one of the cabinets and removed a thick folder. These are follow-ups, news clippings, social media updates, public records, all documenting the lives of those I've helped, their successes, their families, their freedom from fear. He handed me the folder, which I took with hesitant hands. Inside were indeed dozens of organized entries, each with a name, dates, and a collection of documentation showing the apparently positive outcomes for women whose names I recognized from the labels in Frank's basement. This could all be fabricated, I said. though the sheer volume and detail of the documentation was compelling. Some of them live right here in Millfield, Frank countered. You could speak to them yourself, though I doubt they'd confirm my involvement. As far as they know, their abusers simply left, or had accidents, or were arrested for unrelated crimes. I closed the folder, my mind racing. If Frank was telling the truth, if his actions, however morally questionable, had genuinely protected vulnerable people, could I justify exposing him? Would that truly serve justice? But if he was lying, if the man standing before me was actually a calculated killer who had constructed an elaborate justification for his crimes, then my silence would make me complicit in whatever he did next. I want to believe you, Frank, I said finally. I want to believe you're the person I thought you were. Kind, principled, just a bit eccentric. But what you've shown me, what you've told me, it's too much to process, too much to simply accept on faith. Frank nodded slowly. I understand. But time is not on our side, Margaret. Michael's visit to you has accelerated matters. A decision must be made. Michael, I repeated. Who is he really? Another vigilante? Frank's expression darkened. Michael is complicated. He helps me when necessary, but his methods are sometimes more extreme than I would prefer. He lacks my discretion. A chill ran through me as I realized what Frank wasn't saying. Michael was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than Frank himself. Is he a threat to me? I asked directly. Frank hesitated just long enough to confirm my fears. Not if we resolve this situation quickly and definitively. And how exactly do we do that? My voice had taken on a brittle quality. You tell me you understand, that you won't interfere, that you'll keep what you've learned to yourself. Frank's eyes held mine. And you mean it, Margaret. I'll know if you don't. The threat was implicit but clear. Frank believed he could read me, could determine if I was lying. And if he thought I was, I thought of Diane, who would be calling the police if I didn't contact her within the time limit I had set. I thought of the evidence in Frank's basement, the photos of me, the bones he claimed were animal, but might well be human. I thought of the 3 men he had admitted to killing, and how many others might have met similar fates that he hadn't disclosed. And I thought of the women in his files, the lives potentially saved or improved through his twisted form of intervention. In that moment, standing in Frank's study surrounded by the documentation of his secret life, I made my decision. Not out of fear, though fear was certainly present, but out of a cold, clear understanding of the situation I found myself in. I understand, Frank, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I won't interfere with what you're doing, but I have conditions. Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. Conditions? Yes. First, you destroy every photo you have of me, immediately. Second, you never enter my property without my explicit permission. Third, you keep Michael away from me, permanently. Frank considered this for a moment, then nodded. Reasonable requests. Anything else? I took a deep breath. Yes. I want to know the truth about Amelia Carson. The whole truth. A shadow passed over Frank's face. Why? That was decades ago. Because that's where this all started for you. And because her shrine is the centerpiece of your basement collection. If I'm going to keep your secret, I need to know what really happened to her. Frank was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Amelia was my student, he began finally, his voice low. Brilliant, passionate about science. She wanted to be a doctor. But there was something troubling her in the months before she disappeared. She started missing classes, her grades slipped. When I asked what was wrong, she would just say she was tired or not feeling well. He moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk as he continued. One day after school, she came to my classroom in tears, said she needed to talk to someone but didn't know who to trust. She told me she was afraid of someone powerful who had been hurting her. She wouldn't tell me who it was, just that she was going to confront them, make it stop. The next day she didn't come to school, or the day after. When the police started investigating, they found out she'd been seen arguing with a teacher the day before she disappeared. Me. Frank turned back to face me, his expression haunted. I became their prime suspect. They tore my life apart looking for evidence, found nothing because there was nothing to find. Eventually, they moved on to other leads, but the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. It was months later that I heard a rumor. Amelia had been involved with someone older, someone married. There was speculation it might have been the mayor at the time or the police chief's brother, someone with enough influence to make an investigation go away. I started looking into it myself, talking to her friends, retracing her steps. I found her diary hidden in a hollow tree where she used to study. She'd written about meeting someone at the old boathouse by the lake the night she disappeared. Frank's voice grew tight with emotion. I went there, found nothing at first. But when I waded into the water near the dock, my foot hit something. A box weighted down with rocks. Inside was her necklace, a distinctive piece her grandmother had given her that she never took off, and a man's monogrammed handkerchief. The initials were RJD. Richard James Donovan, I whispered, the name coming to me suddenly. The superintendent of schools back then. Frank's eyes widened in surprise. Yes. How did you know? There was a plaque with his name in the district office when I interviewed for my teaching position here. They called him a pillar of the community. Yes, that's how they remembered him, Frank said bitterly. Not as the man who likely killed a 19-year-old girl who threatened to expose him. You took the evidence to the police? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Frank laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. I tried. They said it was circumstantial, that the handkerchief could have gotten there any number of ways, that perhaps Amelia had stolen it, or it had been planted. Donovan was untouchable, friends with judges, the police chief, everyone who mattered in this town. So you took matters into your own hands, I said, not a question but a statement. Frank was quiet for a moment. Not right away. I tried to live with it, to move on. But I couldn't. The injustice of it ate at me. And then, 3 years later, when I saw that sophomore girl with the bruises, something in me broke. Or perhaps it was something broken finally healing in the only way it could. The conviction in his voice was unsettling in its intensity. This wasn't just vigilante justice for Frank, it was a sacred mission, born from his failure to protect Amelia. What happened to Donovan? I asked. He retired early, moved to Florida, lived another 20 years before dying of natural causes, surrounded by family who never knew what he was. Frank's voice was flat, emotionless. I considered going after him, planned it even, but in the end, I decided to focus on those I could still help, not revenge for those already lost. The story rang true, fitting with what I had seen in Frank's basement and the historical facts I knew about Millfield. It painted Frank not as a calculated killer, but as a broken man who had channeled his guilt and grief into a distorted form of protection. It didn't make what he had done right, but it made it understandable, human. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. Frank nodded, the weight of decades of secrecy visible in the slump of his shoulders. So we have an agreement? You'll keep what you know to yourself? I hesitated only briefly. Yes. But if I ever have reason to believe you're targeting someone who doesn't deserve it, or if Michael comes near me again, all bets are off. Fair enough. Frank extended his hand. Neighbors, then? I looked at his offered hand, the same hand that had buried evidence, that had pushed a man to his death, that had carried out a personal crusade for justice for decades. After a moment's hesitation, I took it. Neighbors, I agreed. But not friends, Frank. I can't pretend this never happened. He nodded in understanding. I wouldn't expect you to. As I left Frank's house that evening, the weight of complicity settled around my shoulders like a heavy cloak. I had made my choice, to protect the vulnerable by protecting their self-appointed guardian, a man whose methods I could never condone, but whose mission I couldn't bring myself to destroy. I texted Diane immediately. Everything's fine, false alarm, talk tomorrow. Then I locked my doors, closed my curtains, and tried to reconcile myself to the knowledge that sometimes there are no clean answers, no clear paths to justice. Sometimes, all we can do is choose the option that seems to cause the least harm, even when that choice leaves us compromised. And I wondered, as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, How many others in quiet neighborhoods across the country lived next door to secrets just as dark, just as complicated, as the one I now shared with Frank Whitaker? 2 years have passed since that fateful night when I saw Frank burying something in his backyard. 2 years of cautious coexistence, of polite waves across the fence, of a secret knowledge that has changed everything and nothing about our neighborly relationship. Frank has kept his word. The photos of me disappeared from his collection. I know because he invited me to verify this myself. A gesture of transparency that was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. He has never entered my property without invitation, and Michael has never returned. In turn, I have kept my silence. Not without questioning my decision, not without moments of doubt and guilt, but ultimately standing by the choice I made that night in Frank's study. Life in Millfield has continued its peaceful rhythm around us. Seasons change, neighbors come and go, community events unfold with predictable charm. On the surface, nothing has changed. Frank is still viewed as the kindly retired teacher who volunteers at the animal shelter and plays chess in the park. I am still the former Chicago educator enjoying her quiet retirement. But beneath that placid exterior, I have become a reluctant guardian of a terrible truth. I watch Frank more carefully now, alert for signs that his vigilante justice might be targeting someone undeserving. I pay attention to local news, to rumors of men who suddenly leave town, to stories of women freed from abusive situations by unexpected circumstances. And sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, I wonder if I made the right choice. If my silence has allowed more harm than good, or if exposing Frank would have truly served justice. There are no easy answers, no moral certainty to comfort me in those moments of doubt. 6 months ago, Frank had a heart attack. Not severe enough to be life-threatening, but serious enough to remind us both of his mortality. During his recovery, I found myself bringing him meals, checking in on him, offering the kind of neighborly support that would seem natural to anyone observing us. They wouldn't see the complex reality beneath these simple acts of kindness, the knowledge we share, the conditional trust we've established, the moral compromise we both live with. One evening during his convalescence, as I was collecting his empty dishes, Frank handed me a sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me," he said, his voice steady despite his weakened state, "I want you to have this. It explains everything: names, dates, evidence locations. Use it as you see fit." I took the envelope, understanding the immense responsibility he was placing in my hands. "Are you sure?" Frank nodded. "I've come to trust your judgment, Margaret. Your sense of justice may be different from mine, but it's no less sincere." The envelope now sits in my safe, unopened but ever present in my awareness. A contingency plan, a potential reckoning, a burden I never sought but cannot refuse. Last week, I noticed something that brought our strange arrangement into sharp focus once again. A new vice principal has started at Millfield High, a woman in her 40s with an impressive resume and glowing recommendations. The previous vice principal, the one Frank had mentioned monitoring 2 years ago, apparently left town suddenly for family reasons. When I saw Frank at the community garden the next day, I asked him about it casually, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Did you hear about the change at the high school?" I said, pruning my tomato plants with perhaps more attention than necessary. Frank looked up from his own gardening, his expression revealing nothing. "Yes, I did. Seems like a positive development for the school." "And the former vice principal? The one with concerns about his behavior?" Frank continued working, his movements methodical and calm. "I heard he had some legal troubles in his previous district that finally caught up with him. Decided to move back east before things got worse here." The implication was clear, though nothing in Frank's demeanor confirmed his involvement. I simply nodded and returned to my gardening, our unspoken understanding hanging in the air between us. That night, I saw Frank in his backyard again, not digging this time, but sitting quietly on his patio, looking up at the stars. For a moment, he seemed like any other man his age, contemplating the universe and his place in it. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful figure with the complicated, dangerous person I knew him to be. As if sensing my gaze, he turned toward my window and raised his hand in a small wave. After a moment's hesitation, I waved back. "This is our reality now. A careful dance of acknowledgement and discretion, of moral compromise and pragmatic acceptance. Neither of us is entirely comfortable with it, but we have found a way to coexist with the truth that binds us together. I sometimes wonder what will happen when Frank is gone. Will I open that envelope and expose decades of vigilante justice? Will I continue to protect the secrets of a man whose methods I cannot condone, but whose mission I have come to understand? Or will I simply burn it all, allowing Frank's complicated legacy to fade into obscurity? I don't know the answer yet. Perhaps there is no right answer, only choices with consequences we cannot fully predict or control. What I do know is this: the world is rarely as simple as we wish it to be. Justice is not always served by the systems designed to deliver it. And sometimes, the kindest people we know carry the darkest secrets, not because they are monsters, but because they have seen the monsters and refused to look away. Frank Whitaker taught me that terrible truth the night I saw him burying something in his backyard. It's a lesson I never wanted to learn, a knowledge I never sought to possess. But it has changed me nonetheless, complicating my understanding of right and wrong, of justice and mercy, of the lengths to which a person might go to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And as I sit here now, watching the sun set over our quiet neighborhood, I find myself wondering how many other secrets lie buried in backyards across America, and how many people, like me, have chosen to keep those secrets, for better or for worse. The answer, I suspect, would terrify us all.